As a kid, and even as an adult, I have been fascinated by dinosaurs. Growing up in the early to mid 80s, I had little plastic dinosaurs that I played with on a regular basis, and those evolved into having action figures that had dinosaur playsets. I used to watch a cartoon that came out in 1988 called Dino Saucers about aliens that came to Earth who were anthropomorphized dinosaurs, who could activate special tech in their armor to reverse their evolution into their base species to give themselves extra strength in combat, even if it was short-lived. In the early 90s, I was fascinated by the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, who wore costumes and helmets themed after popular dinosaur species. But in 1993, I encountered a film that not only changed the landscape for big-budget motion pictures in Hollywood, it revitalized my love and fascination for dinosaurs in a way that I hadn't experienced since childhood. That film was the Steven Spielberg blockbuster Jurassic Park, based on the book by Michael Crichton. When I first started seeing trailers for the film of Jurassic Park, the scene that always stuck out to me takes place near the end of the film. Dr. Ellie Sattler and Dr. Alan Grant are hiding in the computer control room for the park, and she assures him that the velociraptors can't get to where they are, and he asks if she is sure, and she responds with,
"You sure the third one's contained?"
"Yes. Unless they figured out how to open doors."
This scene stuck out to me because it created this idea of incredibly intelligent dinosaurs that overruled everything I had learned about dinosaurs as a kid. The books I read showed dinosaurs as being sluggish and dragging their tails, having pea-sized brains, and incapable of strategy and intelligent thought. Prior to this, I've never even heard of a velociraptor before, and despite the grandiosity of the Tyrannosaurus Rex in the film, the velociraptors really stole the show. I wasn't much for any major horror elements. My overactive imagination as a kid wrecked me for the longest time. Even closing in on age 11, memories of watching Aliens with my dad in the late 80s messed me up, and my first thought, despite the name of the film, leaned towards some kind of monstrous extraterrestrial thought. But summer of 1993 rolled around, and I ended up going to see the movie, and while it terrified me, it also thrilled me in equal measure. I ended up seeing it twice in the theater. I still had no idea that it had been based on a book, even though the credits at the end of the film said, based on the novel by Michael Crichton. The following school year, I got myself a copy of the book at my school's annual book fair. I enjoyed having my dad read to me at night before bed, even when I was going into middle school at that point. And we sat down and we read the book together. One of my favorite lines of dialogue from the entire story, and it's the only one that ever stood out to me from the book, is when Ian Malcolm and John Hammond, the park's creator, are having an argument in the survival bunker, and Hammond gets so frustrated with Malcolm's pedantic riffing about chaos theory that he calls him a supercilious bastard.
I really hate that man.
Those two words, supercilious bastard, have stuck with me for more than 30 years because of how funny they were. But the book stuck with me even more so because of the intelligence behind the literary work and how vastly different the book was from the actual film. That's not to say that the film wasn't great. It absolutely was. But there are parts of the book that were far more terrifying than the film would have been allowed to get away with if it stuck to a PG-13 rating. We'll talk about the differences between the film version and the book version in another part of this essay. The book was published on hardback by Alfred A. Knopf in November of 1990 and was an instant success. The paperback edition was released to shelves in December of 1991 by Ballantine Books. This is one of the copies that I had. This 13-month interim between hardback and paperback editions fell on the faster end of the standard 6 months to 1 year transition for popular books. By May 1993, just a month before the film was released, the book sold 5.7 million copies. Much of this was largely driven by anticipation for the movie. The plot centers around a wealthy entrepreneur creating a theme park with genetically engineered dinosaurs who invites a group of experts to visit the park and assess its profitability in the midst of corporate sabotage and system failure, turning the entire location into a deadly trap. The book explores themes of ethical boundaries in science, the dangers of unchecked technological advancement, and the unpredictability of complex systems, which is basically what Ian Malcolm rambles on about whenever he mentions chaos theory.
See, here I'm now by myself, talking to myself. That's chaos theory.
Given that the author held a Bachelor of Arts in Anthropology from Harvard and had a medical degree from Harvard Medical School, He leaned into the scientific realism in his writings. Whether it was the virology of the Andromeda strain, the anthropological and historical elements of books like Timeline, Congo, and Eaters of the Dead, or the technological advancements happening in the late 20th and early 20th centuries, Crichton invested in making sure that real scientific concepts were being discussed, even though some of the details were fictionalized for the story. The book itself was scientifically more dense than the movie was, and the tone, as I mentioned before, was darker, more suspenseful, and often more violent. The film more or less follows the same trajectory as the plot in the book, though there are some major differences which we will come to in just a little bit. John Hammond invites a group of experts to tour his park, and everything goes to hell with the same level of corporate espionage seen in the book. The experts include Doctors Alan Grant, Ellie Sattler, and Ian Malcolm, and attorney Donald Gennaro. We are also introduced to senior engineer John Arnold, biotechnologist Henry Wu, game warden Robert Muldoon, and chief programmer Dennis Nedry.
Hello, Newman.
Hello, Jerry.
There are some characters who show up in the film and the book, but have either a limited role or have their roles reversed. These include Hammond's grandchildren, Lex and Tim Murphy, and veterinarian Harding. The PR director for the park, Ed Regis, is nowhere to be seen in the film. There were some additional character changes to the film that were reversed from what took place in the book. For example, the attorney, Gennaro, sides with Ian Malcolm in the pessimism about the park's creation. In the film, Gennaro is a money-grubbing sycophant, licking at Hammond's boot heels. Even Lex and Tim have some changes to their characters. In the book, Tim is the older sibling, and he is the computer fan as well as being a dinosaur enthusiast, while Lex is a little bit of a tomboy. In the film, Lex is the older sibling, and she is the computer nerd, while Tim is younger and more of a tag-along, and still a dinosaur enthusiast. Dr. Grant has some substantial character differences between the book and the film. The book portrays him as being very friendly and enthusiastic towards kids, whereas the film portrays him as being antagonistic towards kids. A key example of this is when he tortures a 12-year-old boy by explaining exactly how velociraptors hunted while poking at him with a fossilized raptor toe claw. Sattler is more or less the same, though the book depicts her as being almost 20 years younger than Grant, instead of being a contemporary. And she is a grad student working with him, not a quasi-romantic partner. Sattler was aged up because it didn't look right on film for a much older man to be having any kind of potentially romantic relationship with a much younger female student.
You don't say. You don't say. You don't say.
Who was it?
He didn't say.
But, jumping back into talking about the film itself, the movie broke ground because of its grand-scale use of both practical and special effects. Even before the novel was published, 4 studios put in bids for the film rights, and ultimately Universal and Spielberg acquired the rights for $1.5 million. Crichton was hired on for an additional $500,000 to adapt the novel for screen, and David Koepp wrote the final draft, which left out a lot of the novel's exposition and violence, and making the changes to the characters mentioned earlier. Even to this day, the original film still holds up well as a cinematic masterpiece after more than 30 years. While the film deviates from some of the book's major and minor plot points in favor of streamlining the plot, it is one of the closest movie adaptations of a book I have seen, with only a small number of exceptions. However, some of those missing plot points found in the book were eventually recycled into Since the initial book's 1990 release and the film's release in 1993, there has been a total of 1 literary sequel and 6 films in the franchise. That's not counting the number of animated spin-offs, live-action shorts, and film-adjacent video games and other media. The novel's sequel, The Lost World, which shares its title with an adventure novel written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, was published in 1995 and was the only sequel Crichton ever wrote throughout his career. It hit paperback a year later, and a year after that, both titles were published in a sort of omnibus entitled Jurassic World, which actually had nothing to do with the 2015 franchise film. The book centers on Ian Malcolm revealing in an incredibly retconned way that he survived the events of the first book and suffered from a form of PTSD and chronic pain from his resulting injuries. It sees him getting recruited by paleontologist Richard Levine to investigate the corpses of strange creatures washing up on the Costa Rican coast, which inevitably leads him to Isla Sorna, or Site B, one of InGen's research facilities on a neighboring island to the original park. They bring a team comprising of Eddie Carr, Sarah Harding, and 2 kids, because of course there's going to be 2 kids in this story. As Malcolm's team researches and explores the abandoned island full of cloned dinosaurs, another team led by Lewis Dodson, the same guy who recruited Dennis Nedry in the first book and movie, shows up trying to get samples so they can outdo whatever InGen created and botched. What follows is the consequences of man trying to control the natural world and disrespect wild animals after they fundamentally misunderstood that they can't control anything. In fact, this becomes a running theme through all the Jurassic sequels. And every single one of these characters, regardless of how much they know of the previous adventures, still thinks that they have the ability of controlling what happens in the natural world. It's all about hubris and failing to learn from those arrogant and fatal mistakes. 1997 also brought us the film adaptation of The Lost World, which, despite similar iconography, Jeff Goldblum's return as Malcolm and Richard Attenborough's return as John Hammond, was marketed as The Lost World Jurassic Park, as if Universal Pictures didn't trust the audience to know what kind of movie they were watching. The film follows most of the major plot threads as the book, except Dodson is nowhere to be seen, and he's replaced with Ludlow, Hammond's nephew, who brings a much larger team and a big game hunter named Roland, played by Pete Postlethwaite. The film also starts a trend seen repeatedly through later films of taking action set pieces from the original book and incorporating them into less graphic versions. For example, the opening scene of the movie with the little girl getting attacked on the beach by compies is taken directly from the opening of the Jurassic Park novel. A scene midway where the T-Rex bites a man through a waterfall is adapted from another scene in the original novel, where that T-Rex is trying to get to Alan Grant, Lex, and Tim hiding in a man-made cave used as an access tunnel. The blood spilling into the waterfall actually comes from the dinosaur biting into its own extended tongue when a tranquilizer dart finally kicks in instead of eating somebody. Dieter Stark, played by Peter Stormare, falls down a ravine and gets swarmed by compies. This was how Hammond died in the original book. A scene on the river in Jurassic Park 3 involving pterosaurs attacking a child and spotting a Carnotaurus at the river's edge is another scene adapted from the original book. And the most recent movie, Jurassic World Rebirth, spliced out the T-Rex pursuing Grant, Lex, and Tim on a lake or river for an action set piece. And this brings me neatly to the point that the sequels don't really do anything different when it comes to storytelling or plot lines. Once the source material was no longer something to work with, writers had to come up with something original. But that's a relative term given how creatively bankrupt Hollywood actually is. If I had to guess, the elevator pitch for Jurassic Park 3 would have been, what if we brought back Alan Grant and he got kidnapped and taken to Site B against his will? In theory, this is a great premise because he was an expert of what happened at the original park, and the people who kidnapped him and subsequently should have been eaten completely lied to him about why they were going to Isla Sorna in the first place. Unfortunately, it left us with a fever dream sequence like this.
Alan.
Jurassic Park 3 came out in late summer 2001, and we wouldn't get another film entry for 14 more years until Colin Trevorrow directed Jurassic World in 2015. That movie's premise pretty much asked the question, what if John Hammond's theme park had actually been a success and then things went to hell? Unfortunately, people don't learn from their mistakes. There's a scene in the movie where characters are talking and justifying the need to make genetic hybrid monsters because normal dinosaurs just aren't as popular or cool anymore. Let's ignore for the fact that this incredibly expensive Costa Rican destination is packed with people on the trams and in the visitor center and on the rides and making purchases at the shops. Like, the ferry going from the mainland to the island is packed with people. I just crunched the numbers, and for me to take my kid to Disneyland in 2026 for just 2 days, with park hopper capacity, hotel stay, parking, and not including food or purchases, that's going to run me anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000, period. I don't even want to begin calculating the cost of flying a family of 4 to Costa Rica and then taking a ferry ride to Isla Nublar to spend a week at a luxury resort full of genetically cloned dinosaurs. Not to mention the fact that these weren't even pure specimens, given the fact that they had to fill in the genetic gaps in the sequencing with DNA from other animals. But I'm getting ahead of myself. 2018 gave us the second film in the Jurassic World series, subtitled Fallen Kingdom. Directed by J.A. Bayona, it begins with InGen's corporate inheritors acquiring samples of dead dinosaurs to weaponize these clones for military applications. In the middle of all this, Isla Nublar's dormant volcano begins erupting, prompting several characters who return to the island to rescue the dinosaurs and bring them to the mainland. As if seeing a T-Rex rampaging through San Diego in the second film wasn't a bad enough idea, this film decides to not just double down but quadruple down on this idea. It's at this point where I feel like the franchise jumped the proverbial shark. The monsters are scarier, and none of the characters actually learn from the past mistakes. They just keep making the same mistakes in bigger, dumber ways. Then in 2022, we got the third Jurassic World film subtitled Dominion. The previous film left audiences with a question. What would happen if these dinosaurs actually got out into the wild? This was a question that was asked repeatedly in the original book, resulting in many of the characters searching out the velociraptor nests and blowing them up to prevent the velociraptors from getting off the island, as they had been doing at the start of the book. Unfortunately, Dominion didn't even touch on this topic, and instead focused on humans trying to traffic dinosaur clones on the black market and trying to weaponize them for pharmaceuticals. Then just last year, we got Jurassic World Rebirth, which for some reason takes the audiences and its characters to Thailand instead of Costa Rica. Why? Nobody knows. Apparently, despite being shown in previous entries, thriving in various ecosystems and climates, all the dinosaurs now have moved to the equatorial regions where it's warm and swampy and tropical. Again, the characters are looking for DNA to use for pharmaceuticals, and of course, everything goes off the rails and people die. Despite the fact that each of these films is raking in close to $1 billion at the worldwide box office, the sequels feel like an exercise in the futility of diminishing returns. There's something about the original film that stands out among the others. Maybe it's the fact that the special effects still hold up far better than anything that has come out since. Yeah, there was a solid use of practical and digital effects in the sequels, but those films kept feeling like a rehash of the same plot points that had been done far better. Especially when we get to scenes like the Dilophosaur, or the spitter dinosaur, showing up in Dominion. Yeah, the chirping triggers that sense of nostalgic understanding of how dangerous they are, but that's all it is. Nostalgia. That's not to say the films aren't rewatchable from time to time, and some of the films, like The Lost World and Jurassic World, have aged far better than others. But the strongest story beside the original was hands down Jurassic World, because it asked the question, what would happen if the park was successful but run by idiots? Seriously, the how it should have ended video on YouTube provide the best, most common sense decisions.
Were those scratches there before?
Oh no, she's escaped! I'll go outside, get in my car, and then call the control room to track her.
Or don't go outside and just call them from here.
All right, I'll do that. Lowry, I need you to track the Indominus.
She's still in the habitat.
Okay, she's still in there. We just can't see her for some reason.
Sounds like camouflage.
Oh, nuts.
There have been 2 animated spin-offs to the Jurassic World side of the franchise, Camp Cretaceous and Chaos Theory. The first series picks up just before the events of the first Jurassic World film, and the second dovetails into the events of Dominion. The stories were interesting because they more or less stayed kid-friendly while offering some decent tension and jump scares. There's a little bit of retconning going on, that a lot of what took place behind the scenes of the films happened because of the characters. Fine, whatever. But why were these stories better than what we actually got in the movies? The reason is consistency. The Jurassic movies were all about recreating that next big movie monster scene or central action set piece as if the scenes were developed first and then placed into a sequence, and then the plot was written to move the characters from one threat or set piece to the next without considering character development or story. The consistency in Camp Cretaceous and Chaos Theory, which takes its name from Ian Malcolm's main focus in the original book and film, is the development of the characters as they navigate survival in getting off of Isla Nublar after the park implodes in 2015, and finding rescue, as well as how they move on from their experiences and PTSD to help prevent corrupt billionaires from using cloned dinosaurs as natural resources. We can ignore the fact that one of the characters is a social media teen influencer in 2015, long before those really became popular. And then, she became a hacker with more skills than your average NSA spook. But, it's a kid's cartoon after all. Let's not look too deeply into that. But the consistency comes from the character dynamics growing as the characters do. Yeah, some of the interpersonal conflicts feel a little contrived. Again, it's a kid's cartoon, so don't think too deeply about it. But there are some real dangerous stakes involved, pushing them to trust and rely on one another. The last few films gave us characters, both new and legacy, that feel as if they were shoehorned in because the cookie-cutter plots demanded that we need humans to get killed and eaten by dinosaurs. There's no reason to care about what they care about because it's so far removed from being an interesting plot. I haven't seen Rebirth, which has probably the dumbest subtitle of all the films. But if you scaled back the name actors like Scarlett Johansson, Ben Bailey, and Mahershala Ali, and if you scaled back the budget to maybe $2 million, this wouldn't even make it to the big screen. At best, you'd get the made for Sci-Fi Channel original movie or miniseries that it actually feels like. The problem is that it's all about brand recognition, and as is usually the way of most blockbuster films, making toys to sell to kids. As a product of the 80s and 90s, I have seen my fair share of that in my time. And it really goes to showcase that old King Solomon was right in Ecclesiastes when he said, "There's nothing new under the sun." If I was to rate the 7 films from worst to best, I don't think it would be that much of a challenge for me. At number 7, I'd place Rebirth because it was the first film in the franchise that I had zero interest in watching, even if ScarJo spent the majority of the runtime in shorts and a tank top. The plot just didn't interest me. Will I see it when it hits streaming? Probably, but I won't be rushing to watch it. At number 6, I'll put Fallen Kingdom because it has some Fast and Furious level of set pieces that fly in the face of physics. Like Chris Pratt trying to outrun a pyroclastic flow during a volcanic eruption. He should have been cooked alive. On top of that, it is really the film where I feel like they jumped the shark and veered towards idiocy. At number 5, I'll go with Dominion. And if any of the films in the back half of the franchise should have been called Fallen Kingdom, it should have been this one because we see the collapse of everything Lewis Dodson built at Biosun. But the focus of the film is ridiculous because it ignores the obvious plot point of actually exploring a new world overrun by dinosaur clones, which is why they went with Dominion. I guess. I don't know. At number 4 is Jurassic Park 3, which spends little time in an actual park and involves by far one of the most obnoxious characters in any of the films.
Are you all right? Thing is safe. We tell you.
Eric!
At number 3, I'll put The Lost World. While it tries to do a good job of picking up the threads of the original film, the fact that they take the action to San Diego, which never happens in the sequel book, feels like it set the stage for the scriptwriters to copy and paste the plot for Fallen Kingdom, with the only change being the volcanic eruption. At number 2 is Jurassic World because I immensely enjoyed this movie, even if it did have some really idiotic characters. And of course, number 1 is the original film, which, if you're surprised, means you haven't been paying attention. That original film was so well done that they make callbacks to it periodically throughout Jurassic World. Like, they even talk about how that original park was so much better, how it was so much more legit. And, like, you have characters talking about that nostalgia for something that came first. It was so well done. Like the original Predator film, as mentioned back in December, it has become a sort of golden standard or litmus test by which all other movies in the franchise are compared. I wish Jurassic Park had been left as a standalone film instead of becoming a cash grab franchise. Unfortunately, the executives at NBC Universal have the same problem as the villains in these movies. They want money. And they will bleed out a great film's legacy to do so if it means making billions, even if they've gone completely bankrupt.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should.
Here's looking at you, Disney. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so through Patreon, both my merch and bookstores, as well as doing a one-time donation through Cash App. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll be back next month talking about the film Lucky Number 11. Until then, I'll find you guys in the fiction.